a very good summary of the arguments. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. It was a great delight to come to where Rianne works, because we've started, as she says, this new initiative, and it's very exciting, and I was very honoured to be invited to work with you. So thank you for that. This is a completely different departure. I sort of came at thinking about water from public space, actually, and you'll see that that kind of runs through the lecture that I'm going to give today. And I want to just give you some idea of how we're going to go with the structure of this lecture, so you can follow. Is it not moving? I'll do it down there. That's okay. So I want to sort of start just by saying some of my general thoughts about the significance of water in everyday life and beyond that. And then I'll do an outline of some of the key thinking and approaches to water. And then I'll do my own approach to thinking about water. And then if we have time, I'll try and introduce you to some of the key issues that come into the book and my thinking about water from a sort of socio-cultural, socio-technical perspective, if you like. So this book is called City Water Matters, and Cultures, Practices and Entanglements of Water. And that's really kind of what the book's about. I mean, I think it captures very much what the book is about. But just to sort of start off thinking about water, we're made of water. All our organs are made of water. In fact, the brain, lungs and kidney contain 85% water. The bones 30%. So we don't only depend on water. Without water, we'd actually die. We wouldn't exist. So in that sense, I think water's interesting because it lies at the heart of the interconnectedness and entanglements of humans with our environment, and reveals, perhaps more than any other substance, the way in which we can't think of ourselves as separate from nature. Now, I think one of the things that's quite important to think, because of the kind of shift in nature-culture sorts of debates, is that water is far from being a naturally occurring terrestrial resource, but it's shaped in all sorts of ways by human activities and cultural practices. It exists as a resource through a sort of complex intersection of socio-technical networks and systems, and is a site of different cultural meanings which vary across time and across space. Water is both a source and a force. I mean, if you think of the kinds of things that are beginning to happen as a result of the climate changes that are so worrying, increasing floods, graphically demonstrate the way water is a force. Water imposes a set of technologies for containing it and directing it, and it's enmeshed in a whole myriad of government and regulatory practices, as well as private markets and complex forms of provision. Its abundance, I would argue, as well as its scarcity, is constituted in public discourses and political decisions. And as Rianne pointed out, these are implicated in relations of power, as much as being a naturally occurring phenomenon. You know, the sort of anti-climate change people tend to say, well, all these things are natural, but I would argue that very much it's implicated in these relations. And water enables and makes possible, assembles, a multiplicity of publics, embodied practices, cultural practices, and diverse forms of sociality. So what I would argue then is water is far from being just the natural resource it's often assumed to be. Water stretches and flows across human and non-human networks. I think nowhere are the effects of human activities on the Earth's ecosystem in the current moment that many geographers denote as the Anthropocene more visible. Not only does water cross boundaries of different substances, bless you, what do you say in Germany? I mean, Holland. I must learn that. With complex intersections and effects, the very complexities of current and impending water crises across the world lead to greater uncertainties as to what kinds of solutions are possible. Indeed, many see water as the most pressing concern of the 21st century, which is likely to lead to massive migrations and water wars. At the same time, there's less and less certainty as to how best to resolve the scarcity of water, or its overabundance in the form of floods or rising sea levels in many parts of the world. So water's never far away from the centre of life and thought. Different civilizations at different times have intervened in the flow of water and its provision, like from the ancient Mayans, the vast hydrological systems of the Roman Empire. Indeed, if you think historically, actually a lot of cultures knew a lot more about water than many of the sort of succeeding cultures that followed. And we see this in the architecture of many parts of the world. Leonardo da Vinci, in his famous Codex, which was written in the 16th century, which, by the way, was bought by the Bill Gates Foundation for £30 million, muses on the role of water in shaping the world, sketching its ebbs and flows, and constructing practical schemes for its management. So to quote Leonardo, we may say that the earth has a spirit of growth, and that its flesh is the soil, its blood the veins of its waters. The lake of the blood that lies around the heart is the ocean. Its breathing is by the increase and decrease of the blood and its pulses. And even so in the earth is the ebb and flow of the sea. I think when you listen to that kind of quote, which comes from more or less 500 years ago, I think it's a great mistake that we often make, that contemporary social theorists think we're the first to posit these things, to posit the human, non-human space where water resides. So water's theorized in many different registers and through many different frames: crisis, infrastructure, symbol, culture, politics, management and delivery, consumption, the economic and the social. And each of these spheres, I argue, are interconnected and related, not easily disentangled. I think this is what makes water a really interesting kind of material to think about. It's emblematic of the powerful interconnections between human, non-human, and nature and culture. And these entanglements are in a constant movement, transforming landscapes and cityscapes and producing different kinds of manifestations of the so-called kind of natural world. I think water has the capacity to make things happen. This is one of the kind of, I think, perhaps more novel approaches. It brings new socialities and publics into being, as Rhiannon said. Water is an intrinsic part of everyday life, but it's often invisible in its workings and taken for granted. And it only really enters public visibility when it becomes a matter of concern, like with its when it's scarce or potential for danger or profit. It's deeply implicated in relations of power and constitutive of social, cultural and spatial differences. It's highly contested, both as a resource and a site of complex meanings. I think when you live somewhere like here or like I do in England, it's really easy not to think about water very much because you turn on the tap and it comes, mostly. But if there's so many parts of the world where that's not the case, and people are much more aware of its meanings and its importance and its significance. I think, as I said before, that water is going to probably be the greatest challenge of the 21st century. But that's not really what my work's about. There are many people who can do this much more expert than I am. What I do is I follow in the tradition of thinking about water as a cultural object and as a source of complex meanings in everyday life, whether it be Mumbai, London, Los Angeles, Paris, Sydney. Humans need water to survive, and many daily practices and habits that often go unnoticed are connected to the presence of water, and that's what I'm sort of trying to delve into, how it underpins those. Water is needed for bodies to keep clean, for embodied pleasures, for ritual practices, for the beautification of urban sites, and so on. And each of these are enabled by the socio-technical systems and practices of a specific historical and material context. I'll put up some of the contents of my book so you can see the kinds of things that I start to think about, and we'll come on to those later in this talk. So my research brings cultural practices to the fore, arguing for their embeddedness in a wider social, political, economic and technological context. So I want to move now, before I end up talking more about that book, just to some of the extensive research on water and thinking about water at the contemporary time. I think one of the main ways that water is framed at the moment is in terms of crisis. There's either too much or there's too little. And climate change, I would suggest, and I think it's hard to disagree, has brought about by much of human activity that's been, if you like, the culprit here in both cases. So wetter regions typically becoming wetter, or drier regions typically becoming drier. I don't know if you've seen the photographs from Australia at the moment, but it's absolutely shocking, you know, how the fires that are going on. And I mean, it has to be, you know, it's extraordinary because this is diversion, but their Prime Minister likes to say it's got nothing to do with climate change. As it kind of burns, the city literally is burning. And I think it's estimated that half the world's population live in areas that are potentially water scarce for at least 1 month of the year. The global demand for water has been increasing by 1% annually due to population growth. And water pollution has worsened in many of the rivers across Africa, Latin America, and Asia. There's been increasing ecosystem degradation due to the poor condition of soil resources, which impacts on the levels of evaporation and erosion. But importantly, water scarcity is unevenly distributed. And I think that's what I was saying. If you live in this part of the world, you don't think about it much. In other parts of the world, it's just a daily problem for people, particularly women. I mean, if you look at in Africa, pictures of women who carry these huge pots on their head, they might have to walk a very long way to get water just for daily use. Now, there's a tendency in much of the current literature towards what I'd say pessimistic discourses. But as the World Water Council points out, the crisis isn't really about having too little water to satisfy our needs. It's a crisis of managing water so badly that billions of people and the environment suffer. They make the crucial point, which is that as long as we don't face water scarcity ourselves, we believe the taps will keep on flowing. And that's one of the problems that the sort of global north, if you like, is assuming something quite different. And huge quantities of water are wasted through water-intensive industry and agricultural practices, and through also individual practices. And I come on to some of those in my chapter about consuming water, which hopefully we'll have time to talk about, the different ways in which we consume water being something that can be changed. It's not fixed. For the former, for the wasted water through industry, you need greater regulation. But for the latter, I think we need to be talking about people's habits and rituals, which are often ignored, which vary very much across questions of gender and race and ethnicity, as I will argue. But there are cultural shifts at a wider level that matter as well. One significant arena is that of food, with a greater understanding now of the quantities of water to produce beef, for example. 1 kilogram of beef requires 1,300 litres of water. It's an extraordinary amount, isn't it? In contrast to potatoes, which 1 kilogram requires only 100 litres of water. So, you know, these are very resource important questions. And I think that's led a lot of people, particularly younger people. I don't know what the figures are here, but certainly in England there's a great increase in vegan and vegetarian diets because people are recognising that. But interestingly, some of those diets themselves are not necessarily thinking about these water questions, because almond milk, for example, which some people have used to substitute cow milk, actually also needs high level of water, and most of that water is actually, most of the almond crop is growing in California. 80% of the world's almond crop is growing in California, which itself is using enormous amount of 2 litres of water to make 1 litre of almond milk, which I think is kind of quite telling. But water scarcity, as I said, is highly political, and so it has impacts on all sorts of things, including deforestation and so on. I just want to know, normally what time do you have questions? So I could aim for another half an hour or so. Yeah. A lot of the kind of questions that people are talking about in terms of this crisis are the predictions towards rising sea levels of 8 feet by 2100. And this figure raised to 11 feet if carbon emissions continue to the present levels. Now, the difference of a 3 feet sea rise and a rise of 6 feet is the difference between a wet but livable city and a submerged city. I mean, these are really very, 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 very pressing questions. Even London, actually, around the river is beginning to be seen as potentially problematic. But major infrastructures like New York's JFK airport or coastal nuclear reactors are likely to be underwater in 100 years. It's very hard to imagine, but this is what's being predicted. So it's a highly politicized crisis which will affect many people in the global south, but also it'll affect people in the global north. And of course, one of the things that's going to happen as a result of the water crisis is a growing number of refugees. We're beginning to see that. So it's going to be migration that's going to be water-based migration in the coming years. So these narratives of disaster can be disempowering, and actually one result of that is to be despairing and passive. And I think there's a real problem sometimes with kind of negative, pessimistic discourses. They sort of stop you doing anything. And it's important to think about how we actually can adapt and change. We can adapt our city environments. We can have different kinds of policy initiatives. I don't want to just sort of be standing here as a doom and gloom person. Local communities can think about new ways of managing water at the local level. Governments can think about different kinds of urban design initiatives to raise city areas or to improve city groundwater management. And also we can shift our water-related habits. We can change what we do. We don't have to just always do it just how we've done before. So I'm not trying to say this is all gloom, but I think I am trying to say that this crisis means we have to take action at both local, individual and national and government level. Moving on then to how geographers have worked on this question of water. They've eloquently drawn attention to water flows and infrastructures as material and physical landscapes of power. Notably, Eric Swingerdew, whose work some of you will have come across, argues that the water supply relies on constant mastering and transforming of natural water, where it's impossible to imagine that the provision of water outside large bureaucratic and engineering control systems, which enable centralized decision-making and monopoly control, where profits can be extracted. So he's kind of coming at that very much from a sort of Marxist or some perhaps post-Marxist position. This kind of modernist project, this vast project, disrupts our imagination of water delivered from the tap at home, as instead being connected to vast, as he would suggest, technological shrines of dams and rivers and reservoirs a long way away. But such a connection only becomes evident when the supply is threatened. As Maria Kijker, who also works on water, she's actually teaching in Amsterdam now, I think. The project of modernity was based on establishing intricate flows of natural elements, social power relations, and capital investment cycles, which not only didn't separate nature from the city, but wove them together, as she says, in a socio-spatial continuum. Now, for both these writers, the flow of water, the flow of power, and the flow of money are inextricably linked, which have the potential to encourage greater social cohesion or generate new forms of political conflict and social cleavages. I think this connects with struggles over the control of ownership and ownership over water authorities which rage across the globe. And where once water was seen as a public good, a human right, which I think perhaps is the way I would certainly argue, with privatization it's shifted into being a source for the extraction of profit, moving from the realm of provision by national governments to the control of global financial markets and national and international markets. Our water authority, Thames Water, which provides water for most of the south of England, is owned by the Australian bank, Macquarie Bank. There's been an enormous amount of debates about that and the kind of fury at the bills being such as they are when all these profits are being extracted. And so it's a very precious and valuable commodity, which has more and more been managed by a market economy, where increases in water prices become a legitimate and inevitable response. The thing about Thames Water is that they have very, very high leakage rates in the pipes. They don't repair the pipes. So as people are paying more for water, more and more water is leaking out onto the streets and so on, which makes people very agitated. So that's kind of one approach to water, the kind of Eric Swingadoe, Maria Kaika view of water connected with infrastructures and power, big profit, if you like. There's another strand of thinking which is post-humanist approaches to water, which has emerged in the last 10 or so years and is based on the idea of redefining humans' place in the world, where the human is seen as one form of life amongst many. So this is the kind of approach I'm sympathetic towards, which challenges that kind of binary thinking, challenges the nature-culture, human-animal, and proposes the notion of nature-culture as a synthesis of nature and culture, which posits their inseparability in ecological relations, which are both socially, biologically, and physically formed. So it's trying to sort of see water from all these different perspectives. Biology and social culture are mutually constitutive, radically producing and shaping one another. And in this frame, the world is conceptualized as open, immanent, and ever becoming. Humans can't be separated from water, but are constituted by it, as well as constituting it. So it emphasizes the idea of kind of water as flow and water as fluidity. And the ideas of things like wet ontology or marine biology and so on are seen as processes where humans and water are thoroughly interconnected. And this is kind of moving away from the kind of notions of fixity, where water is just kind of this material that's sort of, as it were, lumped as a kind of fixed material object, but more seeing that it's undergoing continual reformation, and that a wet ontology, as they say, can reinvigorate, redirect, and reshape debates that are all too often restricted by terrestrial limits. And some of the feminists have drawn on the French theorists to argue for a kind of post-human feminist phenomenology, which sees our bodies being fundamentally part of the natural world and not separate or privileged in it. I find that interesting kind of way to think. And now I'm going to move on to the fourth way of discussing water, which I guess is the one that's kind of where I begin to kind of see myself most closely aligned, although I think all the ideas that I've suggested so far underpin the way I would write and think about water in my book and in my research. But this fourth strand engages more with water as a cultural practice, or a cultural object, if you like. They've done a lot of work about this in Australia. Some of the interesting work about on water research comes from Australia, in fact. And here, Allen and Sophoulis make the distinction between everyday water and big water. That sort of big water idea is quite interesting. It's the kind of idea of the large technological approaches that I was talking about, sort of the way Eric Swingadoe talks about water, whereas they're talking here about the idea of everyday water, which focuses on cultural meanings and water practices embedded in daily life, like washing, cooking, bathing, gardening, drinking, and so on. And that's set against the idea of the sort of much larger sort of socio-technical way of thinking about water. And they explored everyday water through a research project which looked at values, practices, and interactions around water, which is something I also do in this book in one of the chapters, thinking about how people actually use and behave in relation to water in their daily lives. I think that's sort of a much more, well, not much more helpful, but can kind of get beneath the surface of how we think about water. Probably the person who's written most from a cultural perspective on water before I started thinking about it myself is a woman who's more of an anthropologist but also a geographer called Veronica Strang. And she takes a similar approach in her books. Drawing attention to the diverse meanings of water, she does ethnographic research in England, in Dorset, and in rivers. And she looks at how water mediates individual, family, and social collective identities and relationships. And she highlights water as a material substance which literally constitutes humans, makes us as we are. But she talks about that in terms of what it means to be human and the way in which water is a natural symbol of sociality and interconnection and human environmental interdependence and interconnectedness. And I found this was sort of, in some ways, perhaps, jumping off point for my own work. She works very much in rural areas. She didn't do anything urban in her work, whereas I've pretty much focused entirely on the urban. So in her book, Gardening the World, she focuses on different beliefs and practices, the example of industrial versus domestic users, and the different forms of environmental engagement. But she says that water has core meanings that occur cross-culturally, and that stand for symbolically for life, wealth, health, spirituality, and so on. And she's not alone. There's other people working are thinking about water as a symbol and source of meanings. So there's been a shift, I think, from the dominance of a way of thinking which focuses on water in terms of hydroengineering, which isn't to dismiss that, but to say there's other things to be thinking about apart from hydraulics, vast infrastructures, the mastery of water in what these Australian writers call the big water. It's a bit like big data. And this is much more to seeing water as networked, interconnected, symbolic and cultural, entangled in a complexity of socio-technical and material assemblages, which constitutes everyday life. But that said, I don't think you can get away from understanding water also as a private commodity, which is exploited for profit rather than being a common good, which is what I would argue for. And that underpins so many spatial and social differences across the globe. So my research in the book, as I said, draws its influence from all these strands in different ways, and argues really most centrally for the importance of water as a cultural object, as a source of complex meanings and practices in everyday life, embedded in the socio-economics of local water provision. I think it's always important to think about whatever you're thinking about or research you're doing, to think about the kind of the local context and how it's developed historically, socially, politically, because everywhere is different, even if there are things we can say that might be same. So I'm interested in the human organized systems, meanings, and practices in a way that doesn't, as it were, neglect the materiality of water and water practices, but which doesn't take those as its primary focus. I think because water is fluid, in some senses it resists definition, in that however much human infrastructures and representations strive to contain and channel water, water continually leaks out of its containment because it's a highly fluid substance that's difficult to contain physically, and because it's essential to all life. Particular cultural representations can never quite monopolize it. So I think it's difficult to encapsulate, connected in different ways, different spaces, to unwanted fluidities as well, of migrants, if you like, in the context of crisis, or gender, or sex, or bodies and identities. So my book and my research, in a sense, is also fluid. It breaks out of traditional boundaries. I'm going to use the last section now to talk a bit more about that. And it does that in a sort of serendipitous way, looking at how different aspects of water, as it settles or unsettles in cities. So I think I'd say water makes and unmakes cities across the ages, enabling and disabling daily life as it ebbs and flows into domestic and public spaces. Yet water is actually often ignored, invisible or forgotten as a vibrant matter in the city. And so the kinds of research I did for this kind of can be looked at, they're almost like different stories. Each chapter can sort of be dipped in and out of, just like water, just like you dip into water. And each chapter and each research project that I did aims to capture one element of water's fluid existence in the world as a material object, cultural representation, as movement, as actor, as practice, and as ritual. So I'll just take you now through some of the content here. I've shown you the the first 4 chapters, and I'm going to sort of just give you a little taste of what kinds of things I was interested in while I was doing this. So this is the other ones that I look at. So we'll go a little bit into this as we go. So I was interested in what I call the embodied water entanglements, the sex, gender, race, ethnicity, and class urban sanitation practices. And it's actually really quite interesting when you start looking. I'm going to show you. When you start looking at how people use water in terms of keeping clean and so on. So in this book, I've got aspects of how people wash, historically, how that's changed, how that shapes the city. I look at public toilets, which actually might seem very abstruse, but actually shows you so many things about the kind of the way spaces are used in cities, and the different practices of cleanliness and sanitation, and laundries. So I did sort of ethnographic research in all these different places and found that they assembled different kinds of public spaces, which are very different in different places. If you look at laundries, for example, which was one of the things in the book, see if I've got a picture. No, it's further down. Okay, so this is New York. In New York, because this is just an example of how water, as it's used for sanitation, affects the spaces of the city. Because it's a very dense population in Manhattan, people can't have washing machines in their own homes. So they go to these laundries where they engage in what they call wash and fold. And there's the whole place is somewhere where people actually interact as they kind of do their washing. Historically in Britain it was the same. There used to be laundrettes. I don't know what the situation is here, but because people couldn't afford washing machines or because they didn't have space for washing machines, they used to go to laundries. Now most of these have closed down. And as more and more of these private washing machines kind of penetrate domestic space. And then you look at somewhere like, in India and so many parts of the global south, washing is a very public activity. This is the Ganges, which I don't know if any of you have been there, but you'll find people using the water of the river to wash and so on. And then historically, I followed this really interesting company called Sycamore Laundry. This is from the 30s. And what used to happen in Britain was that the rich households, or at least even middle-class households, used to not do their laundry themselves. They didn't have washing machines in those days, so they sent their laundry out to this company called Sycamore Laundry. These are their laundrymen. And they had these vans that were going all over England, all over London, picking laundry up, putting it in these vast sort of turbines and washing places which were in the suburbs, and then doing the washing, bringing it back in these boxes all nicely folded and clean. So it was sort of out of sight. The laundry was, for those households, it was part of something invisible. They didn't know how it happened. Now, actually, the same company, they do the royal laundry for Windsor Castle. It was quite fun. I sort of went in and saw the laundry boxes that they were sending back to Buckingham Palace and so on. And they're still going, but they've completely changed in terms of who they're serving. So it's just an example. If you think about public toilets, one of the quite important issues now is because a lot of, in the city, like London, there would be public toilets provided by all the local councils, but now that they've closed them down, a lot of them are nail bars, and a lot of them are actual bars where you go drinking. The one near me is called Gents and Ladies, which is the old name for a toilet. And you go down these rickety old stairs into this really kind of quite grotty underground kind of bar, and you sit there and drinking gin and all the rest of it in what used to be a public toilet. Now, this is all quite fun, but it's obviously a sign of gentrification. But what it means for a lot of people is they can't come into the city to shop, because especially older people or people with kids or people who, actually need a public toilet to come into the city, this acts as a deterrent if there's not such places to go to. So you begin to see how, if you start to kind of explore at this sort of level about the importance of something like a public toilet, that it shapes the way people move around in the city, it shapes the kinds of spaces people occupy, it shapes their possibilities and options. So I'm trying to sort of suggest through these kinds of examples the way in which water matters in public life. So that's kind of one example. I did a lot of work on the I did quite a bit of work on public water fountains. This is a very interesting thing too. If you look historically, fountains in places like Rome and Istanbul, and a lot of the, particularly those two cities actually, if you walk around the cityscape, you'll see them everywhere, the old fountains. And they used to be places where sort of public personages were celebrated, you know, political, local people who had power. And they were sort of places that were kept separate from, they weren't part of, let's say, everyday life in terms of interaction. And maybe people would sit on the edge. That was about as much as they would do. On sort of New Year's Eve, they'd jump in and when they were drunk, you know, get thrown out by the police or whatever. But they weren't sort of part of public space. Whereas now there's been a real shift towards thinking about water fountains, public water fountains, public spaces as being a place to enliven, to bring people into the city. And you see this all over now, these kinds of public water features like this. They're really interesting too because they're actually digital. They're made possible actually by a kind of digital change, because underneath these kinds of spaces or somewhere on the side, out of sight, there'll be a very complex computer which will be arranging the water to do all sorts of things. It dances, it goes up, it goes down, it does. I'm sure you've got them in Holland. And what you see is people come into these places because it enables people to sort of assemble. They become public spaces. This is actually really just a kind of piece of, not concrete, but, you know, this would otherwise be just a big space that nobody would use. But having put this fountain, this new type of fountain into that space, it assembles a multiplicity of publics. And there's a very, very interesting one in Bradford, where they had, which is in the north of England, which was a city that went into a huge industrial decline when the steel industry closed. And so much so that, you know, there was a lot of poverty, a lot of division. The centre of the town was big roads. The 1960s modernist planning had sort of basically put big roads around the centre of the city, and it was a very alien kind of environment. And then the urban regeneration officer there got this good idea. She said, let's get rid of all the roads, get rid of the old planning that was so difficult to relate to, where people just had to cross huge roads. Take it out, and she made the whole of the centre of the town a great big pool, massive pool. It's really lovely to look at. And in that place, when it's a hot day, 2,000, 3,000 people assemble, and it's a very ethnically diverse city, Bradford. So it becomes a place where people mix, and it's like this. It's very, very shallow water, but there's fountains that bring people in, and they come and bring their towels and sit down and so forth. So, I mean, this kind of thing can really have an impact. Water becomes something that creates these new sorts of public spaces. I'll give you a couple more examples, and then it might be time for questions, I guess. So let me think what you might like to hear about. Well, another thing I looked at was the river. Rivers are very important for cities, as you would be aware. Many, many cities in the world, if they're not constructed as ports on the seaside, they're constructed on rivers. And it's just, again, it's a taken for granted thing. Most major cities have something to do with water in terms of their origins. So I did a wonderful sort of study, really, of how the river had changed in who it had assembled. And it had a capacity, the Thames had the capacity to, over time, as it were, assemble many, many different peoples to it. So in the 19th century, before containerization took place, there was 4,000 people working on the river every day. If you look at early paintings from that time, or even earlier, it's absolutely packed. The river's actually packed. Canaletto paintings, you'll see that the river's packed with so many boats that you can virtually walk from one side to the other across these boats. And this was a space of work. Gradually then you get the changing processes of global capital and international movement of trade, and you get containerization, and the city then dies. And this has happened in a lot of places, and for maybe 10, 20, 30 years, many cities turned their back on the rivers because they were just sort of wastelands in many cases. And then now you get this all turning around again, and rivers have become places that bring people to them. They become connecting points. The Thames now has a whole passenger service that goes up and down. People, go there to bathe and so on. So you've got this kind of, as it were, artery to a city that then assembles people in complex relations that change over time. And to follow that history through, which, I mean, I could go on about it for ages, but, you know, is a really interesting way of beginning to understand a city through its river, through its water. Tells a story, if you like. So finally, I guess, I'll just quickly say about swimming. I mean, again, this is something that's really changed in the last 20, well, no, it hasn't changed, because, I mean, this women's pond in London, in one of the parks, has been there since the 19th century, and there were two ponds in this place called Hampstead Heath, which is near where I live. One was a women's pond, one was a men's pond. They had them as separate so that women could have, you know, in the Victorian period, women could go and sort of swim without being under the gaze of men and so on. But now it's become this really popular place which brings hundreds of women in on a hot day, and through the winter people swim and they create all these associations and forms of sociality. Completely mad, if you ask me. They swim in freezing water, but it's, you know, it's somewhere that people really value and they're very attached to it, and when you talk to people about it, it's somewhere that they sort of see as symbolic and, you know, gives them a sense of belonging, gives them a sense of spirituality, a kind of whole resonance of water with their daily lives. So there's just so many ways, I think, as through all these examples that we see that water matters to people. So in conclusion, I guess what I'm looking at is the specificity of different water sites and different water practices, and they're my core concerns. And to kind of reiterate some of the key themes, one of them is this idea of the interconnectedness of humans and non-humans, of nature and culture, and the complex entanglements of water in all its many forms. So that's kind of one of the things that underpins all the sites that I look at. The second argument is that water constitutes multiple differences, which are themselves not fixed, but which change across time and place, and that those differences also constitute water sites. So it's like a kind of interconnected, interactive kind of thing. The third point is that water is implicated in relations of power, as I've said, often invisible, but present nevertheless in daily life. And all its rhythms and all its forms, I think. And these differences are connected to power and water sites, and resources mark boundaries and borders and are political and contested. A lot of the sort of stories I tell in this book are about contested sites and how people have fought to keep certain kinds of places as places they can swim or places they can do various things. So finally, I guess, I would argue water has the capacity to assemble a multiplicity of publics, constitute new socialities and connections that are often changing. So through looking at particular sites and water cultures, you begin to understand quite different things about the city. It gives you a lens for thinking about different kinds of, it's a different kind of window onto the water. I think this kind of work needs to be carried on, and we're going to talk about this more tomorrow, but it seems to me that there's so many ways one could take this approach to thinking about water. But if you think about the history of Angkor Wat, it attests, I think, so vividly that to cities and their inhabitants needing water. Without water, we'll die, and so will the cities, and so will their cultures. So I think I'll sort of finish on that point.